There's been very little research about the sexual behaviors of people who suffer from bipolar illness. Dr. Rif El Mallakh is a psychiatrist and director of UofL's Mood Disorders Research Program at UofL, and he's here to discuss his research. Rif, good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you very much for having me back.
Yeah, I know. As always, you're going to be a regular on this show here.
It's always a pleasure to talk about our work.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here. All right, well, let's start off the top and talk about bipolar illness. What is bipolar illness?
Yeah, so bipolar illness, the old name is manic depression. It's a disease where people will experience episodes of being very energetic, maybe not sleep very much, and along with that, they may end up doing things that might be problematic. And one of the things that may frequently happen during these episodes where they get into problematic behaviors is maybe sexual indiscretions. These episodes are called manias. They don't generally last very long. The average duration in America is only about a month, which is a long time, but still not particularly long, but they can be devastating mainly because of these potential behaviors.
So when you're talking about sexual indiscretions, you're talking about somebody that's married and fooling around? Are you talking about somebody that just goes on a sexual binge, or what are we talking about here?
All of the above.
Okay.
Essentially behaviors that are different from the patient's baseline. So things that they do that they wouldn't otherwise do. So some of the inhibitions that they have that keep their behaviors in sort of their acceptable range, acceptable for the patient, maybe even acceptable for society, are lost during these manic episodes. And obviously, they can have very bad consequences in terms of their social life. They can have bad, if it's sexual, it's mainly focused on their social life, but it can have bad consequences if they do spending sprees, other legal problems. So manias can be quite devastating.
And so you're saying that manic depression is the same thing as bipolar disorder?
Yes.
Exact same thing. So why do they call it two different names? Why do you all in the psychiatry business have two different names for it?
Well, really the name was changed from manic depression to bipolar illness because the word manic was too close to maniac, and
the connotation was bad.
Yes.
I got you. All right. So you looked at these folks. By the way, we're talking with Dr. Rif El Mallakh from the University of Louisville. He's a psychiatrist, and he is the director of the Mood Disorders Research Program at UofL. So you did this study looking at folks who have bipolar illness and what their sexual behavior was.
Yeah,
so what'd you find?
So there's this lore that, these people get manic and go on these with problematic sexual indiscretions, but there's very little real research about what true sexual behavior is. That is, you have one or two people that may do this, but the question is this really part of the illness, or people, when they're manic, they're actually manic for a very small fraction of their lives. So what's the rest of their sexual history like? And that's actually, bizarrely enough, never been looked at, because this is we see this, when we interview people to try and find out what illness we have, we almost always ask about this stuff. And interestingly, we don't actually know much about sexual history. And there's sex is really all about reproduction. I mean, the reason for sex is reproduction. And so a big part of what we wanted to know was reproductive success of people with bipolar illness.
And what'd you find?
Well, two interesting things. First is that if you look at the overall sexual behavior of people with bipolar illness, it's really ultimately not different from the general population.
It's like you and me.
Yeah, just like an average individual. An average person with bipolar illness, their sexual activity is just like an average individual. And so there isn't anything about this illness that makes that different. But more importantly, perhaps, when you look at reproductive success, what is generally called fecundity, people with bipolar illness have fewer kids. So on the average, Americans have a little bit less than 2 kids. People with bipolar illness have around 1.6 kids. Of course, obviously you don't have a half kid, but on the average.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
So they're about 25% less fecund. Their success in reproduction is about 3/4 that of somebody that doesn't have the illness.
What's the reason for that, do you think? Could it be that people that have bipolar illness just don't want to have kids because they know they've got a mental illness?
That could certainly be part of it. What we did was we looked at fecundity or reproductive success before the diagnosis and after the diagnosis. And before the diagnosis, it was really no different than the general population. So until somebody gets the diagnosis of bipolar illness, their drive to have children or their ability to have children is no different than the general population. After the diagnosis, it changes dramatically. And so, but we don't really know why. We know that the patients themselves, at least half of them, believe that stigma, that is how the world perceives them, may have had some effect on their course of their lives.
Meaning what? That once
people,
they tell people they have bipolar illness, they're going to back off and not want to have sex with them, or not want to marry them, or whatever.
Right. And actually, marriage is but this has been known for a long time. And the average in America, the average number of married individuals is about 53%. Mm-hmm. Among people with bipolar illness, it's only about 33%.
Oh, really?
And so marriage is definitely less. There's more breakups of marriage, but that, there are lots of reasons for that. People with bipolar illness may have financial issues, may have, again, social issues. People with bipolar illness also have more medical issues. And so there are lots of reasons why the success of marriage declines, but then the success also of reproduction declines. And that's interesting. We're not the first people to describe that. That's been described before, but we've replicated that.
What percentage of people out there have bipolar illness?
Or
diagnosed. How about say diagnosed bipolar?
About 1% of. Okay. There are 2 types of bipolar illness: type 1 and type 2, and we studied both in the study. And the numbers aren't really different between type 1 and type 2 in terms of the sexual activity, but it's about 1% for each, maybe 1.5. America actually may have a slightly higher rate of bipolar illness than, say, Europe or Africa, and that may have to do with migration. That is, folks that are more likely to take the risks of migration might have more of these genes.
Well, as a psychiatrist, what would you tell the folks who are potentially in relationships or sexual relationships with folks who have bipolar illness? Are they a danger? Are they, they're having fewer kids, so is that a good thing or a bad thing, or is that,
having children is ultimately an individual decision, individual meaning the individual couple.
Right.
But no, I don't think, again, the sexual
stereotypes?
The sexual behavior of people with bipolar illness is no different than that of the general population. So I wouldn't say anything. You live your life.
They're just like everybody else. But some folks, if I find out, I'm having a relationship with someone and I find out that they have bipolar illness, I might step back and say, as you talked about earlier, the stigma is, well, do I really want to have kids with this person? Because, they're going to have some mental issues down the road.
The likelihood, if you have type 1 bipolar illness, the likelihood that one of your children will be affected is about 30%. So it's not trivial. And there is also something called genetic anticipation with bipolar illness, which is the disease may get more severe from one generation to the next. And so there's evidence that indeed happens. things like earlier age of onset, perhaps greater treatment resistance. So there are reasons for thinking very carefully about whether you're going to have children. And as you mentioned earlier, some of the patients themselves decide, I've been through a lot with this illness. I'm not so sure I want to have a kid that goes through what I've been through. So there's a lot of that break on there, and explains maybe some of the drop before diagnosis and after diagnosis. But for the other person in the couple, the best thing to do is learn about it. If for people here in Louisville, for example, there's an organization called the DBSA, the Depression Bipolar Support Alliance. They have self-help groups that meet here in town. And on Tuesday nights, one of the self-help groups is actually for significant others. So people who, if you were in that relationship, going to that group, talking to folks who are in relationships with people with bipolar illness would be a very wise thing to do.
All right, interesting study, interesting information from Rif El Mallakh.